Okay, cool. Thank you, Renee. All right, so we can start. So I'm really, you are fortunate. I was going to say I am, but actually we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Reddock, Professor Rhoda Reddock from University of the West Indies. If you ever going to get your money's worth from coming to Cornell, I keep saying that for every speaker, so it is this time. But I'm serious about this one for a different reason, and that is she was recently the deputy principal at University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, which is an equivalent to being the provost. But for years, the way that I know her and all my contacts with her have been that for years she was the head of this Institute for Gender and Development in Trinidad and Tobago. She is a leading Caribbean feminist scholar, activist, educator. She's received all kinds of major awards, including an award from CARICOM, which is the Caribbean, you know what that is, community. And a lot of research projects on women and labor in particular, gender and history, the intersectionality of race and gender. But one of her big projects was the whole question of Indians in the Caribbean. So she has done a lot of work with another professor, Patricia Mohammed. I know she mentored another young prof who is becoming quite formidable herself, Gabrielle Hussein. Now, all of this is an amazing contact for you too, because we professors at Cornell expect that people like you will go on to be the next generation of scholars, intellectuals, and so on. So the kinds of contacts that you make with people in these institutions like UB are really important to your work being advanced. So after class, make sure you get her info, and email is okay, I hope. But she's also a dear friend, and let me tell you how we met. We went to, it sounds like years ago, and it is, oh my God. We went to the memorial for Audre Lorde. When Audre Lorde died, I went to the big memorial, which was held in a major cathedral in Manhattan. And it was a beautiful event with poetry and all kinds of nice things. So then afterwards, we were up front because they said you can come and take something like a shell, because Audre Lorde left to collect shells. And I went up, and that's when I met Rhoda, and we talked. And since then, we've always stayed in contact and maintained a friendship and intellectual partnership and all kinds of other nice things. So I'm so pleased she's here, and we were fortunate. Remember I told you guys I wasn't sure, and you looked at Chutney in the soca, and she was on that. That's the person. She was looking different with the afro. And we were fortunate that she was in New Jersey this week just visiting. And I said, you could, please come up. And we didn't know it would work out. I was talking to Brianna to see if we could get the bus. Yeah. But she did, for the Penn Station. She was the one recommended New Jersey. Right. And then came up yesterday on the bus with her partner, Dean Allen, who is an artist in Trinidad and Tobago. So Dean is in the back. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Reddock, who's going to talk about Indians in the Caribbean and Brahmins. And she's the authority, so whatever she says,
Yes.
it's more valuable than whatever I would add from the text that we are reading.
So thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to speak to you. Young people, and I remember there was a time I was around your age. In fact, that video Chutney Soka was taken many years ago. And once I showed it to my class, and they were laughing because, of course, the glasses were so much bigger. And look now, the big glasses are in fashion again, but that time they were really laughing at me. Anyway, so it's a
Do you want to know who they are?
Yes, that would be
Maybe
nice.
just briefly just introduce yourselves to her starting, just to get like a sentence that she knows who she's talking to.
So my name is Brianna Barrett. I'm a senior in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm a government and Africana Studies double major, and I'm from New Jersey.
Okay, great.
And I'm Soren. I'm a junior in College of Engineering, and I'm from Nepal.
Great.
I'm Kata. I'm a senior in government, and I am from Brooklyn and originally from Belize.
Oh, nice.
My name is Jesse Taylor. I'm a senior animal science major from San Francisco.
Great.
And from original.
From the Bahamas.
From the Bahamas.
I'm Wesley J. I'm first year English, PhD. I'm from England.
Great.
I'm Alana Das. I'm a sophomore, and I'm a bio major, and I'm from Jersey City.
Great.
I'm Claudia, junior in Arts and Sciences, linguistics major, LSB minor, and I'm from Puerto Rico.
Great.
My name is Saad, and I'm a junior at the College of Business, and I'm from Kuwait.
Hi,
Hi, my name is Brittany Moncrief. I am a sophomore majoring in biological sciences, and I'm from New York City, Queens.
Hi, my name is Che White. I'm a junior in arts and sciences. I'm a bio major, and I'm from Yahweh, New York.
Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Julia Reeves. I'm a sophomore in arts and sciences. I'm currently undeclared and I'm from Philadelphia.
Hi, I'm April Townsend. I'm a sophomore majoring in English and history, and I'm from Nashville, Tennessee.
Great, I really like interdisciplinary
Very great.
groups. Yes, that's wonderful.
Nice mix.
So you really get a broad education and not narrowly in your field. That's wonderful. Okay, so I just wanted to say something about indented immigration. Now, as you probably know, the Caribbean, we usually define the Caribbean, I'm sure you all have, by those countries bordering on the Caribbean Sea that have a history of plantation and slavery. But in the as you probably know, slavery extended from, let's say, from about the 17th century until the 19th century, at least. So that when slavery was abolished in around 1833, 1838, many slaves refused to continue work under similar conditions. I think that's very important because there's a kind of myth that the slaves ran away from the plantations and therefore they had to find new laborers. But in fact, the slaves were refusing to continue to labor under the same conditions as existed during slavery. And we have used the opportunity to bargain or to develop other forms of economic activity, free villages in Guyana, for example, which necessitated the planters trying to find other populations that would continue to work and produce sugar, but other crops, but also to continue the profit making that was necessary or that was seen as the reason for plantation production. So the system of indented or immigration or bonded labor was introduced, and in fact Indians were not the first group. There were Chinese, I believe as early as 1804, there were Madeirans from Portugal, there were even free Africans who after slavery, after the British abolished slavery, you know, there was a lot of slavery still taking place. Brazil, the United States, France, Spain, etc. So Britain used to kind of go around the seas capturing other people's slaves and freeing them because they of course didn't want the competition of enslaved labor when they no longer had it. So there were also free Africans who were brought to the region. I understand some went to the Bahamas, some went to Trinidad and Tobago, not sure where else, and they were hired as bonded labor. That is, they were hired to give labor for a number of years under certain conditions, but they were not enslaved in the same way as the slaves were. But immigration from India proved to be the most successful in the eyes of the planters. It was most plentiful because India had a large population and had experienced a famine and an economic crisis, which meant that there were people willing to leave. Also, because India was part of the British colonial world in particular, there were opportunities for trade within the British Empire, although it wasn't limited to British colonies. So there were a number of reasons. Also, I believe the Indians were accustomed to, this is what was argued, to similar kinds of work in plantation-like circumstances. And of course, they said the climate was similar in certain areas. So Indian immigration was the most successful, beginning in Guyana in 1938, after which it was stopped after a couple of years, and then it resumed again in 1945 to Trinidad and a number of other Caribbean countries. And a lot of people may not be aware, but we have at least 10 countries here. There was, of course, the then British Guyana, Trinidad, not Tobago at the time, Suriname, Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Belize. All of these countries received indentured Indian immigration, but to varying degrees. The countries that had the largest populations were Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and little less in Jamaica, much less in Jamaica. So what you'll find is that in the countries where the Indian populations were significant, their impact on the whole culture and lifestyle of those societies was much more marked than in the countries where their impact, where their numbers were smaller. In the larger countries, they were able to maintain aspects of religion, food, etc., that were not kept in the same way in other countries. However, contemporary research suggests that there were influences that may have not been recognized at the time. And of course, the majority came from the northern provinces of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which up to today are among some of the poorer areas of India, and a minority from South India to the port of Madras. And there were cultural differences between the North Indians and the South Indians. But because the North Indians predominated in many parts of the region, their culture, religion, ideas, practices prevailed. I think in the French colonies, probably because France may have had better connections in the South, they got more of the South Indians, and therefore there were differences in some of the cultural relations of those areas. And these laborers were supposed to bond, work for 5 years, after which they could get a return passage at the end of their indenture. And I just want to mention the notion of Jahaji Bai, or brotherhood of the boat. That is a very important trope that emerges, which was used to refer to the relation. So the people who came with you on the boat became a kind of relative, you know, as you entered the new society. So the word Jahaji Bai is very characteristic of that passage, as well as we speak of the Jahaji bundle. You know, we still speak of your Jahaji bundle, which is the stuff you brought with you from India. So this is the route. You'll see here that it was a long trip coming from Asia right down to the Cape of Good Hope, right up, would have taken many hours, actually much longer than the Middle Passage between Africa, and the Caribbean. So that trip would have been a very long trip. And this is a photo, I believe, of newly arrived Indians from Guyana. These are primarily women here in this photograph. But as we'll see later on, women were the minority of those who were brought. And this is the kinds of immigration pass that each indentured laborer was provided with, that would have your name, usually one name, spelt however the person who was writing it down spelt it. So you find that almost in every area of Indian indenture, the names are spelt differently, you know, and also this would have, sometimes they put your caste, where you're from, descriptions, etc.
Some of those are still available. You can actually
Oh
see
yes,
one.
yes, yes, you can still see some of these passes. Now, when they arrived, sometimes they would send them to particular areas. In Trinidad, that was Nelson Island, where they would delouse them, you check them for health, etc., before they were separated and shared among the plantations. And I think what is interesting is that both women and men worked on the plantations. There was traditionally a division of labor that continued from the slave experience, where women worked primarily in the field, men had more of the skilled tasks. But this is very important, because before I did this research, it was many, many years ago, you never had the impression of women working in the fields. Somehow you had the impression that there must have been a kitchen somewhere where these women were working. But there was no kitchen somewhere where these women were working. They were working in the fields, weeding, planting, reaping, which is something they continued doing until not too long ago in Trinidad. And men did some of this, especially reaping, but they also worked like the trucking, putting the canes on the trucks that had to take them away, working in the mills with the refining and other activities. And despite the hard work that women did, sometimes as long as 10, 15 hours a day, they were, females and children were paid lower wages than males, of course. And the females could never be the leaders of the work gangs, who were called sidars. And there was an attempt to restrict them to certain areas. So for example, that pass we just said, you couldn't, like, for example, leave wherever it was and go to Georgetown or Port of Spain to Lime or to hang out. You had to show your pass and you had to get permission to leave. So these were efforts to control the laborers, but also, it was argued, to control their interaction with the rest of the population, to ensure that they were kept separate and did not mix with, for example, the predominantly African population in the rest of the country. So you find that there were some very early attempts at separation and divide and rule. They lived in barracks where they would receive some basic rations like rice, oil, flour, etc. And alcohol, of course, sugar plantation, rum, was freely available. In some instances, they may have been paid in rum, or they would have, let's say, been allowed to use their wages to get rum from, let's say, the shop on the plantation, so they would become indebted to the plantation shop for rum. So it continuously be owing this shop. So of course there was a lot of alcoholism, and of course that alcoholism affected the situation of men and also impact on women. Now, after the first period of indenture, many immigrants agreed to a second period, but many returned home. But it's very interesting because there's an Indian scholar called Prabhu Mohapatra. He wrote a wonderful essay called Longing and Belonging, if you ever find it online, where he speaks about the Indians saying, when they found they weren't getting their return passage, begging to go back, marching, demonstrating, we want to go home, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually they get home. And then when they get home, they miss Trinidad. So they start petitioning and marching again, saying, we want to go back. And he was speaking about this kind of longing and belonging. In other words, wherever they were, they were longing for the opposite situation. So this is a more recent photograph. This would be like about the 70s or 80s with women cutting cane in this is a Trinidad plantation. Right. Now in 1917, the immigration system was abolished. And this is very interesting because a lot of the arguments for its abolition centered around women's what indentureship meant for women. In other words, the whole argument was that by indentureship, these women were going to a debauched way of living. They were no longer under the control of their husbands and fathers. They were lowering the image of Indian womanhood, etc., etc. So these were a lot of the arguments that were taking place in India that eventually led to the abolition of the system of immigration. And by the early 20th century, you begin to see some economic differentiation. So for example, some families that had ended indenture and remained in the country began to set up small business, get into economic activity, market gardening, dairy production. The Indian woman selling milk in the urban areas was a very iconic figure, shopkeeping, etc. And then the Indian caste system, of course, had to be modified on in engagement with the plantation. You're aware of the caste system in India?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right. Now, the caste system is very much based on distinct occupations, on notions of pollution, etc. But, you know, when they came to the plantation, a lot of those things couldn't happen. You had to be mixing with all kinds of people in the workplace, in the houses, in the barracks. So there was a lot of pollutant relations. And then there was also a shortage of women, which was also very interesting when I began my research many years ago. Because the planters didn't want women because they assumed that women would be weaker, less productive workers, which of course was quite the opposite. And therefore, in the literature, the historic literature, you see a lot of discussions about they wanted women, but not any woman. They wanted the right kind of women, because the women who eventually went would have been women who were either Brahmin widows who could not remarry, or women who had been like temple dancers, or not the kind of women they felt should come. But these were the women who would sign up to come. And therefore, these women, of course, were less controllable when they arrived. And there are many stories of these women, because many of them would marry people in the depot in India. You know, you're going on a long journey alone. They were single women. Maybe they'll marry a guy they meet in the depot. But when they arrive in Trinidad and see more things, they like leave him and go with someone else. So of course all this behavior was very anathema. And in the historic records there was a man in Trinidad, for example, who used to be writing these long letters to the colonial office complaining about the behavior of the women, because the women were exercising a degree of freedom and independence that was unacceptable to the men. Also, because there was a shortage of women, you'll find that women and girls got a new value, because marriage is a critical rite of passage in Hindu traditions, and one doesn't really become an adult until one is married, and the householder is one of the most revered positions for a man. So you had all these men who could not marry because there were not enough women to marry. So that was a big problem, and it affected, well, of course, caste system went out the window because it was better to marry somebody than to not marry anybody. And then if even you married somebody, there was no security that this person would remain with you. In fact, there was a case that was cited by someone of this man who would keep selling his daughter and never delivering her, because apparently there was a period where bride price replaced dowry, which was the tradition, because men who had daughters, whereas in India a daughter was like a sad thing, daughters now had a certain value because they could then demand certain things for these daughters. But certain key caste hierarchies and values were maintained. For example, Brahmin deference and leadership. Hypergamy, that is the rule which exists in most traditions, but in the India caste system it had a certain meaning, that women must marry people of equal or higher status, not of lower status. Endogamy, you marry within your group. In India, this meant within your caste, within your community. In Trinidad or the Caribbean, it would be translated to mean within your quote-unquote race or ethnic group. So what you find is that even though the caste system in its purity could not be applied, caste values continue to shape interactions among Indians and between Indians and other groups in the society. They were also unable to maintain occupational differentiation. So if you, for example, in India, you have castes of people who do this, but in some areas there were. For example, you still had castes of jewelers, leathercraft workers, barbers, continuing to some extent, lesser and lesser degrees. some groups were able to maintain those occupational differentiations, but the majority could not. So Hinduism continued to be the majority religion and was able to be maintained in the larger territories. Islam continued as the second largest religious grouping. And there were some Christians who came from India, but especially from South India. And of course, South Indian practices were marginalized, but maintained in certain communities in a subordinate way. We find that some of the South Indian practices were been stronger in Martinique and Guadeloupe. For example, some of the South Indian practices would have been like the Kali Puja, the fire pass ceremony. Those are very marginalized, and amongst, I think in Guyana though, the Kali ceremony is very big. In Trinidad, and you can tell me if in Guyana also, I believe so to a less extent, the Canadian Presbyterians became very important in educating Indians. They set up Presbyterian schools. A lot of Indians converted in order to attend those schools. And the Presbyterian converters became a group of socially mobile Indians who were like among the first teachers, doctors, etc. Many of them would get scholarships to go to Canada to study. So that became one way of social mobility. Now, as I mentioned before, the majority came as individuals. Families were formed in the region. And there were attempts to recreate the Indian joint family, but of course, as we saw, there was resistance. And due to the shortage of women, in many instances, men would live together in barracks, which led Sean Lucas Singh, I think I spelled his name incorrect, Megu, I believe is one of your readings, to suggest that created the possibility of a kind of homoerotic Jahaji Bai relationships on the plantation. Now, by the end of the 19th century, you see attempts to try to control women. I think in both Guyana and Trinidad, laws were passed against harboring the wife of an immigrant. In other words, enticing the wife of an immigrant. In other words, these laws never acknowledged the woman as having agency. So they would charge men for enticing them or harboring them, which means keeping them in their houses. So if you go through some of the newspapers of the time, you see these court cases where the woman said she didn't really go anywhere, she just went to visit a friend or things like that. And also, so in addition to legislation as an attempt to control women, you also had violence. Plantation violence was an important factor in trying to, what I call, reinsert these women into a form of New World Indian patriarchal family. So of course, but this was interesting because in all areas of Indian immigration, Fiji, wherever, there were high levels of plantation violence, probably for the same reasons. And in addition to murders of women, there were also a lot of suicides among men. So clearly this was a very difficult experience that resulted in a lot of psychological and also physiological trauma. Any questions, clarifications before I move along?
I noticed you said homoerotic to make sure not homosexual. So, Megu isn't saying that it could translate, but more like a love for other men, or does he leave the possibility open?
I think
from male relationship.
I think he leaves the possibility open, but he has no evidence.
Okay.
He just leaves the possibility.
Just saying that it could lead to.
Yeah. In other words, another understanding of the notion of Jahaji Bai.
Okay.
Right? So this trope of Jahaji Bai comes back in many different forms. Okay. Now, this thing of the Indian family coming as individuals is important because there used to be a view that the African family was destroyed, but the Indians kept their family. But it's not true. The Indian family was reconstructed in the new world. Okay, so women and gender relations. From a lot that I've said before, you will see that some of the factors that would have affected. I think I mentioned some of these already, but at the last point there, that Patricia Mohammed notes that even though there was this resistance by women, yet Indian women colluded with their men in stabilizing Indian family and household in the 20th century. And she developed a concept known as gender negotiations, which she was influenced by Denise Candiotti's notion of bargaining with patriarchy, where she argues that despite Indian women accepting, in a way, this reinsertion into this patriarchal family, they would negotiate with their husbands, for example, to allow for daughters' education or to allow for, in other words, so she would argue that there was a space where they could negotiate their situation. Right. Race and ethnic relations. Now, I think it's important to note that Indians came to the Caribbean with negative notions of blackness. Dark skin color was already stigmatized and stigmatizing in Asia, including South Asia, so Japan, Korea, wherever. Dark skin color was stigmatizing. It was a sign of low status, and etc. And in India, South Asia as well. So they came with this stigmatizing notion of blackness, and this was compounded by European anti-black racism, which was deeply embedded in the system of coloniality that was established from the inception, and of course as a basis for the slave system. So this resulted in Indian prejudices against Africans based on skin color. At the same time, Indians on entry into the Caribbean were often viewed as heathen, backward, because of course they would have been less influenced by European and Western values than the Africans who had been there earlier. And they were stigmatized and looked down upon by Africans, Europeans, and other Creoles. So in other words, there was not much of a mutual appreciation campaign taking place. Nevertheless, there are many stories of, because many of the Indians who went to the plantations, there were still some Africans who were working there. So there are stories of very good and strong relationships existing, especially in rural communities where people grew up together, knew each other, especially in the South and those parts of my country, and probably in some parts of others as well. Now, the Creole nationalist movements of the 1950s and 60s in Trinidad and Tobago, and to a less extent in Ghana, because there were different politics there, they perceived the future as one of Indian assimilation into the dominant Creole culture. And you all have done Creolization, right? So in other words, Indians would have met Creole society in existence, a Creole society influenced by Europe, Africa, and all the other influences that existed. And the assumption was that Indians would somehow assimilate and integrate into that Creole culture. And they did to some extent in other parts of the region where there were smaller numbers, Grenada, St. Vincent, to a lesser extent Jamaica. But in the larger territories, they campaigned for a multicultural resolution to this situation. So what you have emerging in these countries is that you have Indian culture emerging as distinct alongside other traditions. So, for example, I think I discuss it later on. So, in Suriname, the Dutch always had this plural society approach, which was actually constructed in Suriname, as opposed to the British colonies, where they hoped that everybody would eventually become British. So, for example, in the British territories and the French territories, you'll find that the Indian languages were almost removed. But in Suriname, for example, everybody spoke all the different languages, because that was, in a way, Dutch culture was very much of having everybody in separate groups, separate language, separate houses, separate part of the village, distinct everything. So what you find that in these larger territories, you find manifestations of Indian culture, religion, artifacts, as symbols of difference. And I think this is important, because as some anthropologist Daniel Miller has noted, that if you look at the lifestyle of the peoples in these societies, the differences of life are very limited. Basically, everybody's eating the same food, speaking basically the same language, doing the same things. But there are these symbols of difference and distinction that, that have become important. So to some extent, Indian culture is deeply embedded in Caribbean Creole culture, although some Indian nationalists are reluctant to admit this. For example, ganja, which is very much identified with Rasta and with Caribbean life, was introduced to the region from India. Roti, which I just saw in the Jamaican bakery in New York City, although we Trinidadians don't believe they can ever make proper roti. And there's an interesting film by what's his name, Richard Funk, called Dalpuri Diaspora, which I recommend, where he went all over trying to find the Dalpuri, which is a kind of roti that we have in the region. He went to India.
I was going to say, I looked for it in India and it was not
popular. He went to Mauritius, he went everywhere, he couldn't find this Dalpuri. So clearly the Dalpuri is a Creole form created from Indian influences, but probably also from other influences within our region.
Yeah, they had a version, but it wasn't the same.
No, it's not the same. No.
But I don't know, I would love for you to go back to that blackness thing, because it's something to really think about, especially now. Because, and this is my own question, when you see Indians who are Madras Indians who are very, very dark, how could they then have a prejudice against blackness if they are that black? Because many of them were blacker skin when you see them.
Let me tell you, there were many Africans who would say they didn't like dark Indians, because this anti-blackness is so steeped, embedded within almost all of us. The colorism is so deeply embedded within all of us. You'd have self-hate, you'd have people trying to look fairer, not go in the sun just like everybody else. You'd have parents discriminating against darker children just like everyone else. So it exists.
Okay, so you're saying it as a continuum.
In fact, once I gave this talk at home, and the big Indian nationalist, he put up his hand and he said, "You're always accusing Indians of not liking black people." I said, "I didn't say anything about people. I said blackness." And then people came up to me after and said, "It's true. They always call us," and they tell me of names. Madinga was the name they would use to refer to dark Indians, because I think the Madingos were a group of African Muslim indented laborers, right, who came, so that it's deeply embedded within the psyche. Yeah. Okay. So what is the contemporary situation? So therefore, in Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, Indian culture exists within a multicultural context where there is distinct recognition of symbolic markers of difference. For example, religion, religious rituals, festivals, the arts, special days, schools. So for example, we have in Trinidad and Tobago what I call the politics of public holidays. You know, so we have Christian
Everybody get
holidays, we have African holidays, we have Indian holidays, you know, and this year for the first time we had a First Peoples Recognition Day, so that is part of the way in which we deal with difference, by assigning certain symbolic recognitions, and then people fight to make sure that they are getting adequate recognition. Then the ethnic tensions exist in all of these societies to varying degrees, often fueled by ethnic-based political parties, which become the basis for the allocation of power and resources. So for example, if you have an Indian party and they win, the assumption is that then they will help all the Indian people, and vice versa. So therefore, this kind of politics continues to be very divisive, even though people sometimes entering the society as a whole would not see this divisiveness as immediately evident. There's also competition among the groups. For example, who is the most educated, who has the most money, who has the nicest cars, so there is ethnic competition, which has resulted in increased, so education, competition over education has become very important because that facilitates social mobility and entrance in the professions that bring status and money. So in fact, I argue that it was this ethnic competition that opened the way for Indian girls to get access to formal education systems, because after a while it became difficult to keep Indian girls from education when African girls were in the system and performing, etc. So some of the earlier prejudices, not wanting them to mix, needing to control their sexuality, fell behind the need for competition, you know, in the public space. Now, in this competition, there is also a fear among Africans today of Indian economic and cultural hegemony. You know, some people saying, oh, these Indians, you know, they used to be poor, blah, blah, blah. Now they're rich, they have bigger houses, they have bigger everything. And of course, Indians who feel that they have, okay, they have achieved well, they've achieved this, but their fear is that they have never been fully accepted as Caribbean citizens. And this, to a large extent, has to do with their minority status in the Caribbean region as a whole, despite their numerical superiority, for example, in Guyana, and parity to some extent in Trinidad and Tobago. This results in a continuous insecurity despite their intellectual and economic achievements. In a recent paper, not so recent, like 2 years ago, I look at this not just in terms of belonging, but also in terms of sexual competition. And this paper is called Looking for an Indian Man. It's in Caribbean Quarterly. You should try to get that, because in that paper, I look at the lyrics of Denise Belfon, who is a very sexually performative soca performer. And she had a hit one year where she says, I'm looking for an Indian man. And you know, she would sing this song, and then Indian men just loved it. And you know, and in the analysis, one of them said is that, you know, in the past they were just, you know, ordinary. What was ordinary? They were doctors, they were teachers, but now finally they were sex symbols. And of course, that is probably the most important.
There's a piece I will circulate that Kumar Bahabir just circulated online. Have you seen it? Where he's complaining about the film that you talked about earlier. No, you were telling me about the film festivals. Where he said 3 of the films this year were about black men and Indian women. Bazuli he mentioned, and 2 others. So he is arguing the opposite of that.
No, but that's an old argument.
His argument is old.
Yeah, but that is precisely it, because there's always this fear that black men as these sexual, you know, kind of more sexually attractive, that Indian women would prefer them.
Right.
So that is why when you have a song when an African woman is saying that these Indian men are sexually attractive. That is a triumph for them after years of being like the sexual second citizens, so to speak. So finally, they were being lauded as sexual objects. You know, I remember Carolyn Cooper saying, which I didn't agree with, the only thing worse than being a sex object is not being a sex object. but in this particular case, I suppose it's true. So that's it. I open for questions, comments, discussions.
You jumped over the writers.
Oh,
Remember
yeah.
You had a little slide on that.
No, I left that over. Oh, what I want to say is that Indo-Caribbeans have established a rich tradition of writing and literature. And of course, V.S. Naipaul and his family. I put here his brother, Shiva Naipaul, his father, Sipasad Naipaul. Actually, I spelled that wrong. It's not with an R. It's a E-R. Neil Bisundat, his Canadian nephew. Vanny Capildeo, his, I don't know if she's a niece or second cousin now. She's a well-established poet in London, and there are others. But in addition, in the 70s and 80s, you had the emergence of Indo-Caribbean women's writing. Some of the early works were by Lakshmi Prasad, Roseanne Kanai, and is it Mahadai Singh? I think it's
Madai, that's not that.
yes, that's an error. I have it later on. So
And you did a lot of work on douglarization. So maybe a
yes,
comment.
yes.
Because we talked about it briefly from the film.
Right. So I just
And
want to
your point
introduce
about-
these texts.
yeah.
This was Brenda Mehta, book of diasporic dislocations, where she brought together Indo-Caribbean writing of that time. That was about a good while ago, maybe about 10 or 10 to 15 years ago. But it was like a classic juncture because it acknowledged the existence of this body of work. And this is the most recent text, Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought, which is edited by Gabrielle Hussain and Lisa Ota, that brings together contemporary feminist-related writings, primarily by Indian women of the Caribbean diaspora, as well as Indo-Caribbean women in the Caribbean, and a few others. Like I have a piece in there. So that's it. So you wanted me to say something?
Just maybe briefly.
About
yeah.
Dougla.
And then questions.
Okay. Yeah, Dougla is a Hindi word, not in mainstream Hindi. I think it's Bhojpuri, which was the language spoken by the North Indians. That meant the issue of inter-Varna union. Varna means like caste or subcaste. And the issue of inter-Varna union was like kind of almost was stigmatized. And that word was Dougla, which meant bastard. And remember I mentioned how these caste values were brought to the region, but then reinterpreted and reapplied in the context of the region. So certainly in Guyana and Trinidad, the word Dougla was used for persons who were born of African Indian union. And it had a very pejorative sense. It was because it basically meant bastard, which apparently in a society where everybody's supposed to be married means a lot. I mean, among Africans where most people never marry and most children are born out of marriage anyway, I don't think it has the same significance, but for Indians it had a very stigmatizing meaning. And for the Douglas themselves, I think for many decades, African people had no understanding of what the word meant, and they used it like a normal word. But all the time they were using it as a normal word, it was a deeply stigmatizing and negative valued term used among Indians or among people of mixed Indian background, because they knew its meaning. I think it's only when we began writing and I actually found that definition, that there was a broader understanding in the society about why that term was so negativized. So for a long time, so-called Douglas were very stigmatized. In fact, I did the first paper really many years ago where I actually interviewed Douglas, and they spoke about being rejected by their Indian family. But it would vary. So for sometimes, what I found is that their identification would be based on how they were treated by their family. So if their African family treated them well, they'd identify as African. If their Indian family treated them better, they identified as Indian. But it would based on that, but also how they were treated by the community. So sometimes we found there were some rural communities where these people were accepted, very rural, poor working class, they'd be accepted, nobody would say anything. They'd grow up in these communities and they'd very much identify with their Indian ancestry. But in other parts of the country, they might be very much stigmatized and, not go with those links to those families. So I think, though, that in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a kind of revalidation of the notion of the Dougla, so that, for example, in the society itself, there's this idea of Dougla as a new metaphor for our societies. In fact, some people have asked for Dougla to replace Creole, because at least Dougla incorporates the notion of Indian, whereas Creole in its original form did not absorb the notion of Indian. Some writers have spoken of Dougla poetics. For example, there was a year when there were quite a few calypsos celebrating the notion of the Dougla, and I actually wrote a paper on that, Jahaji, by the emergence of a Dougla poetics. And I've been advised, there's a new book out by Fern Regis who argues that contemporary Douglas, unlike older generations, now value and identify as Douglas, and there's a more positive spin on it. So there's Dougla as idea of some sort of nation where groups coexist, and then there are different ways in which people have experienced the experience of being Dougla, and then there are all kinds of other discourses like the Dougla body. What does it look like? What does it mean? And so there's a whole discourse on Dougla that has emerged right now.
Cool. So we'll take some questions. For the next 15, we have 4:10, about 20 minutes. Go ahead, April.
You were talking about the issues of sexualization and desexualization of men based on race. Could you talk a little bit about how it applies to women, and along the same lines, or is it different?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Okay. Well, historically, the women of the other are always in context of conflict among men. Access to women of the other is also part of the prize of conquest. So that is why it is not simply a matter of people having relationships. There are also symbolic meanings. So, for example, for Indians, of course, there were questions of endogamy and hypergamy and all those rules, because in hypergamy, in the rule of hypergamy, blacks were seen as lower, and therefore for an Indian woman to marry a black was also to break caste rules of hypergamy and to lose her own caste. So it was a bit more complex. So for men, therefore, access to women of the group bestowed status. So that even though Indians valued endogamy, Indian men who married African women did not face the same degree of stigma, because that woman got his status. She became part of his patriarchal line. So he didn't lose status by doing that. at least not as much, right? It was still looked down on, but not as much. However, following, so having women of other ethnicities is always something that men want, you know, whether they actually marry them, have long-term relationships, so it's different. But just that experience is part of the victory over the other. And therefore, these women are always kind of exotic because of their difference. Now, of course, for all men, sexual performance is a very important marker of masculinity. And so no man wants to feel that his ability or is challenged. But then you have in the Caribbean the situation where black men historically, you know, have been constructed as in this hyper-masculine, hypersexual kind of situation, so that Indian men therefore always felt in some way as you know, having to confront this reality, and always the fear that their women deep down really prefer these other men. So when these other men actually have relations with, it's like a confirmation. It is like so it breaks many rules. It breaks rules of endogamy, rules of hypergamy, but it's also challenged men's control and feelings of sexual performativity. So it's a very complex situation. I think African men don't understand that complexity. They just find that these Indian men, they just like to, they don't like to share their women, you know? Whereas for most African men, they don't have a problem with Indian men. However, when Denise Belfort brought out her song, for the first time, you saw men complaining, writing to the newspaper, because they felt for the first time that their sexual performativity was in question. And that is what was really interesting. And that is what made Indian men so happy, why they liked that song so much. Because finally, the African men were not the sexual performers, they were the sexual performers. So for example, Denise Belfort would perform her song, and she would call men on the stage, and these men would just fly up on the stage. They were so happy that finally, and they had achieved everything else, but this elusive factor was finally theirs. Wow. So for people like Kumar Mahabir, there are many reasons why he would object to that. Because in a way, I have argued elsewhere that women's bodies become, in a way, the space over which many battles among men are fought.
I thought I saw Brittany's.
Yeah, I just wanted an explanation of like the caste system, like if you could elaborate on it a little bit more. Only because like one of the readings described it as if like the planters created a caste system where it was like whites and then those who are mulattoes and then those who are African, and somewhat like that the Indians were somewhat kicked out of the caste system and not really recognized.
Okay.
So I didn't understand.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a very wrong use of the word caste. In fact, there are many people who have used the word caste to describe racial systems in the West and North America. And in fact, there's a Trinidadian sociologist, Oliver Cromwell Cox, who wrote a big book called Caste, Class, and Race, where he critiqued Gunnar Myrdal, who was the blue-eyed boy of the time, who was arguing that the racial system you had in the U.S. was a caste system. So, and I think that to make the two, there are systems of status and of hierarchy, but I think to equate the two is incorrect.
Right, that's a good, we were bringing this up in my other class because Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, she argues that there's a racial caste system now for people who've been in caste.
Yes, but if you understand the complexity of caste, it is very different, you know. And so for example, in a caste system, one is born into a caste. There's nothing you could do about it. And although some castes attempt, the entire caste might try to raise its status, by maybe doing good deeds or by to stop eating meat or something like that. But caste statuses exist, and of course in history groups always try to improve their status. Now when you have these caste hierarchies, a lot of the castes are also linked to occupational groups. So like the Brahmins were supposed to be the priests. Later on that got linked to the teachers and things, but not normal teachers, really big gurus and things like that. And then you had some groups who were like the soldiers, then you'd have groups who were like jewelers, some who worked in different agricultural castes, and then castes would have subcastes. So it was really a very complex system. So each Indian who came to Trinidad would have had a subcaste name, and that subcaste, there are four main castes, I think: Brahmins, Sudras, Vaishyas, and I can't remember the next one, but each of those was then divided into subcastes. And those castes had strict rules. For example, upper castes were not supposed to do certain things. There were notions of pollution. So that is why you had to have people to clean, because cleaning was polluting. So that the upper caste couldn't clean for themselves, because that would be polluting. You'd have a whole caste whose job it was to remove what is called night soil or feces, because nobody else could touch it because it was polluting. So it's such a... And then there were some people who had no caste. They were outcasts or untouchables, and they still undergo severe oppression and subjugation in India. And in fact, they have movements that to fight the caste system. But the caste system is so deeply rooted that it's so hard to get it out of the Indian system. They've tried in India to have what they call systems where people from lower castes can get like affirmative action to go to university. And sometimes when they try to implement it, some higher caste people commit suicide because they don't want to be mixing with... It's so deep that I think that just to compare that with what is on the plantation, it's not... The plantation system had its own complexities. So in fact, what I argue is that when they came to the Caribbean, no doubt caste values still exist, but they could not be implemented in the same ways. Just the way of life meant that they couldn't, but they continue to influence how they saw others. New categories, new groups got incorporated, so the whole thing got reconstructed, and it didn't die. The values may not have died, but the system itself could not survive. So I think it's incorrect to refer to what was a very hierarchical, color, class, racialized system in the Caribbean plantation or post-plantation system. But to equate them, I think that's a problem.
Okay. Another question? I had, in your talk, you brought up the Brahmins. I said initially, I think that came up in my own talk last week. I thought the predominant group would not have been Brahmins.
Right, that's an interesting point.
But why would Brahmins come as indentured laborers?
Well, there were two reasons. Okay. First of all, there was a big famine in India, and people were being pushed off their lands by, I can't remember the word that it was used to them. So many people migrated to seek a new life. In fact, it was found that some Brahmins hid their caste because the planters didn't want Brahmins, because Brahmins they felt couldn't do plantation labor. But Brahmins were never the majority. But what we know is that they were a larger proportion than originally assumed. So, but what was important is that a lot of the women were Brahmin widows, because in India, widows are not allowed to remarry. Okay. And I mean, a woman could be married from age 10 And to her older man, he dies. And then after that, she's stigmatized. She's not allowed to remarry. She's treated like dirt because she's seen as responsible for his death. So there was like no life for widows, especially poor widows.
So that would explain.
So this was an opportunity
That absolutely explains
for
it.
them to get,
And would explain the population of women.
exactly, to get a new life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Questions? Jeremiah?
I had a question in relationship to food. There's this debate between, I've seen between Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Trinidadians, Indo-Guyanese people, curry chicken, chicken curry. And I have the hypothesis about it myself. But I wondered, like, there's like that nuance, and it's like something that keeps coming up over and over and over again. And I would think that, with like a diasporic population, that it would be the same. It's different. Is there any?
Well, that's an interesting, that's an interesting issue. But I would say that, you know, Trinidad may have had different linguistic influences. Like when the Indians first arrived, the lingua franca would have been French Creole. A lot of people don't know that. In fact, someone I know who, she's a linguist, a Trinidadian linguist, and she married an Indian, and she did her PhD. Her PhD research was interviews with people who returned, and she was interested in the language. And she found in the Bhojpuri that was spoken by returnees, there were some French Creole words that had got integrated into the language that they took back to India. So that I think that it would have to do with kind of French translations. So whereas Guyana never had that French influence, Trinidad also had Spanish. There was a newspaper at the turn of the century in Port of Spain called the Trinidadian that was written in 3 languages. You'd never believe, because we are so hopeless at languages now, because the British really worked on us to get us to speak English, so that whole multilingual character that was there just not too long ago has disappeared more or less. So that I think Guyana had different, they had the Dutch and then the British. We had Spanish for 400 years, and then the French, which was the largest population, and then the English. So we find a lot of our English Creole is based on French translations, so that could probably account for it.
Okay, another question, comment? Alana, I know you have a question. So it's sitting right, waiting to come up.
We were talking about the racial tensions between groups. Do you think that contributed to the rise of domestic violence, started at women?
Well, I do not know, because that domestic violence was common to all locations of Indian indentureship, be it Fiji, be it Mauritius, be it wherever. So I don't know if the ethnic tensions that we had, like in the Caribbean, would have accounted for it. Maybe, but I think that it was more 2 reasons. One, the lack of control over individual women that existed. For example, there were stories, I remember there was an article on Guyana where they said that these men would, have these wives, and she would be wearing every piece of, his investments would be in jewelry that she would wear. And then she would walk away with all his investments, So I think it was really, in my view, an attempt to reestablish control, but it was also a result of alcoholism.
Mm-hmm. Well, the story we read has the woman fighting back, but that's not usual, right? That's just Ramabai, you would say?
No, I think you would have had women fighting back, yes.
And she chops him with the cutlass.
Yeah, well, I think you probably had a few of those, but yeah, but and it would depend on the time, the era.
Question and another question. Surab, I know you have a question.
No, honestly, just processing all of this.
Processing all the
I mean,
information.
it makes so much sense with so much things that I've experienced in the past, and then as a kid, we don't really question things that go. So I mean, it's all like things come back, and then you're putting pictures together.
Mhm.
And that is
No, you
very
can line it back
true.
up.
Like a
Mhm.
lot of these analyses
I like that.
we have, most people don't have, and I think it's so important
Right.
that ordinary people get these analyses so they understand sometimes why they're behaving in the way they do.
Mhm.
Like, for example, most people don't know they are having caste values that have continued. They just behave in the way they know how to,
Mhm.
but they don't have an understanding of why they think or behave or do the things that they do. So that's why I think that these kinds of analyses need to go beyond classrooms
Right.
and
right.
beyond academics and.
We had a nice talk yesterday, which I know April attended, where the idea, the Fanonian point about make of me a man who questions, and I still like that because it leaves us with all these questions. There's one other one. I hope Wesege is going to ask a question because he's from Uganda and they had a similar issue with Indian business interests. And
But they
so
were
on.
different.
And
That's different.
Yeah, but I'd
Yeah.
love to know what his question
Okay.
would be for you. But the other thing is, when I went to India in 2006, we learned that many of the South Indians who had already mixing, there's what he said of mixing of African people, because they're Afro-Indians.
Yes, the cities.
Quite a few
Yes.
groups of cities.
Yes.
So I think some of them would have probably made it to the Caribbean, because they've been there since the 5th century.
The thing is that there are lots of South Indians who look like Douglas. In
Yeah,
fact, there are
absolutely.
Douglas who say they go back to India and they are accepted as Indians, but in Trinidad they're perceived as Douglas. Because Indians can look like a lot of things.
Exactly.
Because it's a continuum. And if you go from North India, where people can look very kind of what you all call Asian in the US, and then go to South India, where you have in addition to the Africans who came from Africa, you of course have like the Andaman Islands just off Sri Lanka that have very African looking people. So that there's a variety, there's a diversity of how people could look. But so that there are, in fact, in Trinidad, there are Indians who were born with curly hair,
Right.
who would be straightening their hair from very young, because that's not supposed to exist, but it's done like very kind of privately and things like that.
Right.
But so clearly there is diversity, and I know Indians, South Indians who have very
Right.
curly hair and
Right.
who have afros and stuff like that. So what is the source of that? It could be anything. So there's a lot more work coming now about the Siddhis who are Africans who went to India like the 16th century with the Mughal empire. But what is interesting about many of these early African groups, many of them don't know they're African.
Yeah.
It's only more recently, like in Mexico, there were Africans in Veracruz who didn't know they were African until this Trinidadian Catholic priest was stationed. They said, but hey, you're from Africa. They said, truly, where is that? And then they began this kind of investigation that identified themselves.
Right.
So that
right.
there are many groups, because of earlier migrations, who went to these parts of the world and were just people who were different, and because India has rules of endogamy, and you find that they probably married among themselves, although inevitably you'd find mixed hair, and in those CD groups you do see mixed hairs. And there are many of these African groups. They exist in Sri Lanka, they exist in India, they exist in Pakistan, these African communities within India.
And that's a whole really lovely area of scholarship. And if you're
Yes,
interested, there's a Trinidadian who died a few years ago named Fitzroy Baptiste, Baptiste,
Yeah.
who did like some of the early work.
Yeah, he
on,
wrote a
like
piece
forests.
called Dogla in India.
Okay, and then he has a couple, maybe 2 or 3 little essays
Dogla in India.
on that.
Yeah.
But when I was there too, some of them were meeting, and they were called backward tribes in India actually. They
Yeah.
were meeting each other for the first time because some were like from north and some were like
Yeah, there
far
was,
away.
yeah.
and,
But there was a big project, I'm trying to remember, it was from University of Michigan, called the African Diaspora. And they looked at African diaspora groups all over the world, and I think they created some sort of database. But that was interesting.
Cool. Okay, so we want to thank Professor Reddock for
Thank you.
I'd love to get a photograph if you don't mind, maybe. If you can open the window and then, so that at least I can document.